Hello, and welcome to tonight's episode of Untold Stories. Tonight we'll be hearing from Julia Garrett. She will be telling us about her mother, Elizabeth Beard King. Before we get into that, though, I'd like to give all of our at home audience a little bit of time to log on and, of course, give some shout outs to some of the cities and states that I see in our little comment section over here. So if you haven't, please take the time now to let us know where you're streaming in from. That's always fun for us to see. Let me scroll up here to the top because it looks like we had some people who already know the drill and started putting their cities and states in earlier. I see we got Washington and Sugar Land, Texas, Dallas, Richmond. Oh, I see New Jersey, California, Pennsylvania. I see Miss Patricia has read Code Girls and is very excited for tonight's webinar. We're glad to have you. Keep those coming in. They're always fun for us to look at, but I don't want to waste too much of our time. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and hand the program over to Miss Julia Garrett so she can share with us her story.
Thank you, Lauren. I'm so honored to be able to tell my mother's story, and I think some of you are seeing my first slide here. And her name was Lydia Elizabeth King, and later she married my dad, so her name would have been Beard. And I'm going to refer to her tonight as Elizabeth because that's what most people called her. And she was a Navy codebreaker, and this is her untold story. Many thanks go to Liza Mundy for writing this book. Without this book, I would have never been able to put together the story of what my mother did. The jumble of papers in my sister's house that my mother left behind when she died would have remained a jumble of papers, and I'm eternally grateful to Liza Mundy. So Liza Mundy writes, the recruitment of these American women and the fact that women were behind the most significant individual code-breaking triumphs of the war was one of the best kept secrets of the conflict. My purpose tonight is to bring to life the story told by Liza Mundy through what we discovered about my mother, but emphasize that all of the women cryptographers, their stories were untold. The first one I'd like to highlight is this woman, Agnes Meyer Driscoll. So unrestricted German submarine warfare in World War I taught us that intercepting and decoding messages during and after the conflict was critical for monitoring events at sea. The small Navy code-breaking group included Agnes Meyer Driscoll. She joined the Navy in 1917 because the Naval Act of 1916 did not specify a yeoman must be a male. She was one of 11,000 American women to join the Navy in World War I. Her brilliance soon became apparent. She began to make codes, which is the best possible training for learning how to break them. After World War I, however, Congress amended the law to correct that a yeoman must be a male, so she resigned. But the Navy promptly hired her back. Although discouraged by her slim chance for promotion in a male-dominated service, she went on to set up many of the processes used for code breaking through World War II. It was Agnes Meyer Driscoll who unlocked the secrets of the Japanese naval codes of the 1920s and 1930s. That's how come we knew they were building a fleet in the Pacific. She, in fact, trained Joe Rochford, who was highlighted in the webinar Battle of Midway, which is here at the National Museum of the War in the Pacific, and I'll refer to that later. I cannot do that topic justice, the Battle of Midway and all the codes they broke. So I encourage all of you to see that webinar. I'll have it on my last slide. I'll have the referral. So Agnes Meyer Driscoll, another very important code breaker, was Elizabeth Smith Friedman, and her mother spelled her name this way, so no one would call her Eliza. They probably never did call her Eliza. She was hired along with her husband, William, and they worked for the Army, the tiny Army code-breaking team. Elizabeth Smith Friedman and Agnes Driscoll Meyer Driscoll were really kind of rivals. They both did the same thing. They were both professionals, And Agnes Meyer Driscoll had a bit of jealousy because William Friedman made more money than his wife did, or Agnes Driscoll Meyer, although they were equals in the code breaking group. And I want to add one more thing about Agnes Driscoll Meyer. In the Navy, she was without peer as a cryptanalyst, said Edwin Layton, who went on to head the Naval Intelligence Unit for Admiral Nimitz. Elizabeth Smith Friedman and her husband William hired the next codebreaker I'll be highlighting here. Her name was Genevieve Grochen, later Feinstein. She was hired to work in the Army code-breaking group led by Eliza's husband, William Friedman. Within months, Genevieve cracked a key pattern in the Purple Code. This is 1940, and they've been working on that code for almost a year. And as soon as Genevieve came to work, she broke it in a couple of months. And that was the reason, I'll explain on the next slide, that was the reason that the Purple Code was broken. The importance of the Purple Code was that here's Hiroshi Oshima. He was the Japanese ambassador to Germany, fluent in German, and Hitler was enamored with him, and he was enamored with Hitler. Hitler told him everything he was doing, buying, thinking, manufacturing. And so through our Breaking the Purple Code, we could listen since 1940. Everything was happening in Germany that Hitler was telling Hiroshi Oshima. And I'll tell you the significance of that in a minute. But I want to go back to the women code breakers that I highlighted, those three. They share characteristics so successful that make them so successful. Many were multilingual, mathematical, musical minds. They were quick to recognize patterns, apply probability, and solve complex problems. Now, the significance again of the Purple Code as I go back to this slide. In 1943, Oshima sent a detailed 20-page report back to Japan in Purple Code about his tour of the coast of France. The Germans called it the Atlantic Wall. It included German divisions' numbers and locations, turret locations, where the tanks were located, and much more. And 1 week before D-Day, Hitler told Oshima he knew the Allies were going to invade, but he was sure it was going to be at Calais. And that's one reason that Eisenhower had such good success invading at Normandy, because Hitler thought they were coming in to Calais, and it was all because of Genevieve Grochen. Today, historians of cryptography, in terms of sheer sweaty brilliance, the breaking of purple is a feat on par with Alan Turing's epiphany about how to break the German Enigma code. So with all of our code-breaking successes, in the fall, I can't do a slideshow about this story without mentioning Pearl Harbor. And the reason that we did not know Pearl Harbor was happening through the Purple Code is that the Japanese did not share it with their German ambassador. He did not know about the events in the Pacific. So we didn't understand what the flurry of messages were. But the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor emphasized to us that we needed to boost our code-breaking efforts. But by the fall before Pearl Harbor, the Army and Navy realized code-breaking was the key to shortening the war and saving lives. So the Navy sent letters to the deans of the East Coast colleges for women, recruiting math and science majors. The Army also realized that they wanted to recruit women. They also sent letters to these colleges, but the Navy told them they were butt out, that they were honing in on their territory. So the Navy turned to more humble institutions and recruited women from the South and the Midwest universities, math and science majors. Women were considered better equipped for tedious, boring work that required close attention to detail rather than leaps of genius. So the Army sent handsome officers to tiny towns, small remote towns. They posted these handsome officers in the post offices and in hotel lobbies, thinking they could recruit women who wanted to catch a handsome husband. Teacher pay was low and class sizes enormous, so they really didn't have much trouble recruiting women away from their classes. And of course, they did not send John Wayne. He was not the officer they sent, but you get the point that I'm trying to make. Well, the Army by May of 1942 allowed women to join the war as an effort as WACs. However, the Navy was more reluctant. Certain admirals said women on ships would lead to chaos. The chair of the Senate Committee on Naval Affairs said, and I quote, women in the Navy would break up homes and lead and amount to a step back in civilization. However, Eleanor Roosevelt and her friends at the American Association of University Women and many other college leaders pressured Franklin. So by July of 1942, he told the Navy to get a move on. And I must tell you about this slide. I show this program to my daughter-in-law. She helped me hone it and make it perfect. And she said, "Oh, Julia, you must put their name under their pictures." I said, "Okay, I can do that." Eleanor Roosevelt and her husband. So my sister and I do not know which poster our mother responded to or why she joined the Navy. We think that she did because her father was in the Navy in World War I in a submarine, but we never asked her why she responded. Did she respond to this poster? Did she respond to this poster? Maybe it was this one. But join the Navy she did on January 2nd, 1943. And during the pandemic was when I read the book by Liza Mundy. And once I realized our mother was one of the code breakers, I called my sister and said, "You get in our mother's papers that you packed in a box out of the dresser drawer, and you send me everything." And it was all there to be revealed. And my sister and I never went in our parents' drawers. We never went in their bedroom in Fort Worth, where we were raised. And there it was in a dresser drawer. After my dad died in Crystal River, Florida, my mother moved all of her furniture to Brady to be near my sister, but she had her own house. She could drive in a little town. She was getting older. When she died in 1998, that dresser drawer went straight to my sister's house, and there the papers were. All of them were there. Her cryptanalysis training manuals, her communication security exams, and this Life magazine was even there. And this is a very good example of how Life magazine, the country was embracing the fact that women were going to serve in the military. And this Life magazine showcased the Navy. The cryptographers that were recruited earlier from colleges were now trained as officers. Those were the math and science and music teachers. Here's a cartoon that was in her papers, a friend of hers sent to her. And I don't know if you can tell how close the screen you can get, but the duffel bag that the woman is holding, besides having breasts on it, has the name Lydia. And this cartoon was perfect for my mother's papers because she was sent by train to basic training in Stillwater, Oklahoma. Probably this cartoon is a humorous take on how the country was feeling about women in the military. Here's a postcard that she sent to her mother, and I will have to read her writing. "Sailors live here" is on the left. In the middle, "in basement" is mess hall. First floor is lounge, real nice. My room, and she circled that room at the corner. That's 301 Cordell Hall, and it's still there now. Oklahoma State University, they're still using that building. Here she is, the first picture you see of her. Here she is on the right. That's Elizabeth with curly hair. And here, along with her bunkmates in room 301, as she joined the Navy in basic training, she would have learned that the Navy way. She would have learned that a work shift was called a watch. When you joined a unit, it's welcome aboard. Personal possessions are gear. A meal is a mess. A bathroom is a head. And what you walk on, even in a building, is a deck. I must say we do have my mother's uniform. This uniform was specially designed by the Navy for the fashion house Maine Boucher, and it was designed specifically to convey to the skeptical public that the Navy cared about and valued its women and how they were perceived. Here's her fleet that she graduated with. And I have the names of many of these women because I have some pictures my mother took of her friends there. I have their names. I've contacted some of their descendants that I can find. I haven't found anyone to reply yet, but I'm going to still work on it. Here is my record of friends in service. It's a autograph book that the Navy provided to her, and it's her friends, the people in her fleet signed it, where they were from, what they thought about her, where they met for her first time. And one of the last entries is this: "Well, King, best of luck. You'll get into Washington and soon will be the Admiral's secretary." This fuzzy picture is very important. I'm sorry it's fuzzy, but it's still very important. Most likely, these co-workers were with her in Washington in the Naval Chapel when they signed an oath of silence. They were told by their superiors, as it says on the slide, even though they were women, if they talked about code breaking, they could be shot. So what did the code breakers do? This picture is from Liza Mundy's book, a declassified photo of one of the code breaking rooms. And I can just barely explain the code breaking, what they did, but I'll give it a try. There's certain fixed ways in which languages operate. So making assumptions of the known elements in a language, one can arrive at a guess. Code breaking depended on flashes of inspiration, but also careful maintenance of files so that a message that just arrived could be compared to similar messages from months earlier. So what did they do, you ask? The women did many things. They listened for coded radio messages from other countries. They collected the names of enemy ships and commanders. They searched for clues such as locations of ships, estimated time of arrival, currents. They studied long strings of letters and numbers looking for a pattern that would reveal a message hidden in a sentence that looked like nonsense. Some typed worksheets used for searching for number patterns. They also tested American coded messages so that we were sure that our messages were effective. Throughout the war, the codes changed and they got more and more complex. So each code needed to be cracked again and again. Broken codes needed to be carefully filed for retrieval if the code was recycled or upcycled. And again, then the webinar that I mentioned earlier about code breaking in this very site here at the museum goes into much more detail, and I would like to refer you to that webinar. And I do want you to remember that Agnes Meyer Driscoll trained Joe Rochford, who's hired in that particular webinar. So she told us three things. She said, I worked in the code room. She said, the girl sitting next to me broke a Japanese code, and we all went out to celebrate. Was this that day? She also said that when a bigwig came to the building where she worked, when a bigwig came to see the admirals, the girls downstairs would call up to her department and they'd all go out in the hall with their clipboards to see who was there. And she saw de Gaulle. This is the day he was in Washington. Here's her family, and the only reason I'm showing this picture. This is my mom and her mother and her brother and sister. Now, the woman on the right is her younger sister, Patsy King. She's just graduated high school in this slide. The reason I know my mother never told her family is that my Auntie Pat overshared. If Auntie Pat had known my mother was a code breaker, it would have been on the Charlotte paper. It would have been in the church bulletin. It would have been on everything she could find. And my Auntie Pat had lunch or breakfast with my mother's high school friends her whole life. She lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, her whole life, and never was a word said to her kids that their Aunt Bebe was a code breaker. So I know my mother's family did not know what she did. According to Liza Mundy, she was one of the 3,000 enlisted women who tested high for intelligence, loyalty, typing, secretarial skills, and grit. And here's her picture before her training happened, by the way. This is a picture overlooking the harbor in Maryland, and you can see under the insignia on her sleeve of the X, she does not have the Q that came later after she finished her communications training. And here she is in the newspaper of Charlotte, North Carolina, Morris Field. The only reason that I'm bringing up this picture of her is that my father, she and my father married, and he had her picture put in the Morrisfield, Charlotte, North Carolina paper. The only reason I'm even bringing him into this story is that before I read the book by Liza Mundy and before I dug through the papers and put them in chronological order and understood what happened, my sister and I told everybody, oh, our father worked at the post office and he saw his draft notice come and he signed up and he was a pilot. He had his own plane and he had paid for his pilot lessons, and she thought he was going to go overseas, and so she joined the Navy. No, that is not what happened at all. Once I gathered the papers, he was already in the service. He was colorblind. He could not go overseas. He could not land at night on a runway that had red and green lights. So he was stationed in his hometown. He was in the pilot training business. He was already in Charlotte. They'd been dating since 1936. This is 1943. She could not marry him because her mother was a widow, her little sister was still in high school, and she worked at Travelers Insurance to support her widowed mother. And the other part of the story is if she had married him, she would have had to quit her job at Travelers because married women could not hold a job in that company. So the reason he's in this picture is the commanders he worked for in Charlotte knew his girlfriend was in Washington, and whenever they had to fly up to Washington for a meeting, they had him fly them. He showed up at my mother's dorm Thursday, September 23rd, and said, "Come on, Liv, we're getting married tomorrow." And there's the letters that she sent her mother. "Well, I guess I'm getting married tomorrow. I guess I'm going to have to wash out my underwear." And there they were. My mother served in the code room through the end of the war. And this is an important slide. The Japanese surrender came across in code, so the Army women code breakers knew before President Truman that the war was over. Here is my mother. Here she stands, shoulder to shoulder, with the 10,000 women code breakers of the Army and the Navy. Like her, they never knew their oath of silence was lifted around 1990, and they could have shared the details of how they shortened the war and saved countless lives. And here was a letter of commendation. I'm just going to read part of it. This was in her papers. While performing your duties in the Naval Department of Communication Office of the Chief of Naval Operations during the period from 22 June 43 to the present time, you have demonstrated an outstanding ability at all times. Your detailed knowledge of the many cryptographic phases of naval communications, your diligence, interest, and keen sense of devotion to duty, your willingness to work long and odd hours have been in keeping with the highest traditions of the Navy and have contributed materially to the successful prosecution of the war. You have every reason to be proud of your achievements. It is with great pleasure I address this commendation to you in appreciation of your outstanding efforts and contributions to the Navy and your country at war. Joseph R. Redmond. She lived a life of service to others. This is my sister on the left, me on the right in the back, and of course my father Boyce, my mother Elizabeth. Her role as a codebreaker remained an untold story until now. She never broke her oath of silence. Lydia Elizabeth King Beard. For those of you listening, I would like to encourage you to look back on the careers of your aunties, your mothers, your grandmothers, tell their story. No doubt many of them contributed to saving lives and shortening the war in World War II. And I want to thank you very much for your attention. I'm back to you. Back to you, Lauren.
All right, thank you so much for sharing your story with us tonight. I always love doing these programs because I'm, constantly learning new things about this period of time. And I'm sure our audience at home also learned some new things tonight. But now is the time for our virtual audience to ask some questions. So if you guys have any questions, please use the chat or the comment section and type your questions in there, and we'll get to them as quickly as we can. But I would like to kick us off with one question that I had. So, for you, as someone who's done a lot of research into the Code Girls and into your mother's story, what is something you wish more people knew just in general about the Code Girls?
Wow, I wish I understood more myself about exactly how they broke the codes and used the worksheets. I think I'd like to know more about that myself. But I'd love to know exactly where my mother worked. I would like to investigate more about, oh, if there are records that talk about her experience, because I'm still really fuzzy about exactly what she did and how they did this. So if I really didn't answer your question, I added another question to it. But I just want everybody to emphasize that these women never told their story. They went all these years they could have shared with their Girl Scout troops and their Bible studies, and they could have elevated themselves in that period of time, and they did not.
Okay, so we have a question. So, Admiral Redmond's letter mentioned cryptography. Why did she feel she had to keep her code work secret?
They were told that if they talked about their code breaking, that they loose lips sink ships, and everybody at the time had that idea. I know my dad knew exactly what she did, but he didn't tell us either. He had a career in the Federal Aviation Agency, and so he was a government man. He would have been one who believed an oath was an oath, and so I don't know any more to answer then it's important to investigate these things.
Do you know if she stayed in touch with any of the women she worked with during the war?
She did. There was one woman in the slide. I didn't read the slide, her wedding slide. Fritzie Cohen was one of the women she kept in touch with, and I have a picture of her and her children. My mother visited her in Massachusetts. I was named after one of the women, maybe in that fuzzy picture. Her name was Julia Tall. I was named after her. My sister was named after Caroline Rouse. She was another one of the pictures, the women in the fuzzy slide. So she did keep up with those women. Yes, she did, as much as she could.
So, next question. What were the college majors from which you said the Navy was drawing candidates?
They were using majors, linguistics and music majors, math majors, also astronomy majors. They recruited astronomy majors. Um, any category in any field that had the enhancement of numbers and patterns and musical timing, all those things would have contributed to a woman being able to break a code.
So, next question is I think just a kind of a verification question. Did you say music majors? Was it because they had the ability to recognize repeating patterns? So, I think that's a
Yes, of
yes.
course. Music is mathematics and music are programs that work in time and space. That's what math is. Math is numbers in space, numbers with time and space. So, any field where your brain is taught how to recognize patterns with time and space would enhance your ability to break codes.
All right, next question. We have a lot of questions coming in. So the next question is, the tedious nature of the work had to be a brain strain. How long were the shifts that they worked?
They worked 24 hours. I think they had 8-hour shifts. And the little bit that I read, sometimes they shared a room. So a woman who had an 8-hour shift would come back, and the woman who had the shift the night before would still be in bed. And so they had to share rooms. They didn't have a lot of housing for these women. They were in, some of them, 4 or 5 people in the same room, and so they worked around the clock. They worked around the clock. But I would imagine the shifts were 8 hours, maybe not 12, but it could have been. Whenever that, whenever the messages started coming in a flurry, they may have doubled up on their uh, their shifts. I don't know the answer, but once the message, they knew something was going to happen when the messages increased, and they may have well doubled their shifts at the time.
Okay. Uh, this next question I think is adorable. So, if the story was made into a movie, what actress would best portray your mother?
Oh my goodness. Elizabeth Taylor. Oh no, she's not living still. Uh, I'll have to think about it. More. Um, Meryl Streep. I picked Meryl Streep for my mother.
Okay. Okay, that was a good question. So our next one is, first part is, thank you for your most interesting and informative presentation. In your research, did you find any mention of the code breakers at Bletchley Park in the UK?
Yes, I didn't even bring up Bletchley Park and the Enigma machine. I put it in my program at first, and I showed a friend that slide and all the Enigma machine, and I had the all the codes and how they broke it. She said, "Oh, Julia, the people will be asleep by the time you finish that explanation. Take that out. Just talk about your mother and the American code breaking." But Liza Mundy explains it very well in her book. Read her book. It's excellent. And really, most of the things I presented today before my mother's picture was what I learned through that Code Girls book of Liza Mundy's.
Can you speak on why it took 35 years for their role to be declassified?
I have no idea, and I've looked to see if I could find exactly the what it did. Congress pass the law that forgave the women their oath? I don't know the mechanics of what happened, and I have no clue why it took 35 years. However, until the age of computers, we still needed to know some of these uh, code breaking processes. So they probably were still pretty important until computers took over the brain the brain trust of the world.
All right, next one up. Has any evidence surfaced that you're aware of that Germany or Japan knew of the U.S. female code breakers?
I haven't heard anything that they knew. I know that the purple code, from what it said in Liza Mundy's book, is Oshima questioned, the Japanese questioned whether purple was still a valid code. And the Germans questioned, and he said, "Oh no, that no one can break that code." And whoever, the people that knew about the purple code was a very tiny group of people. They could not possibly show their hand that they had broken purple. It was too important.
Do you know if your aunt ever learned what your mother did? Like, ever?
No, she did not. I know she did not, because, of course, she died before the book came out, but not very long before the book. And I know she did not know. She really did overshare. She did tell everything, and she did not know what my mother did, not at all. And no, neither did her brother. And her mother, the Lydia in that story, in the picture, died about 3 years after that picture was taken. So I never knew her. She died just after my sister was born in 47.
This one might be a little tricky because she did take her vow so seriously. Do you know of any? Do you know if she made any contributions to any of the major Pacific battles?
Well, she did. All I know is that she sat next to the woman who broke a Japanese code. And see, remember, they were breaking all these codes. They were breaking supply ship codes. They were breaking um, They were breaking all kind of different codes. There was more than just one code they worked on. There were several. And some of the ones that were less complex were sent by the merchants that were providing supplies to the Japanese sailors. I'm sorry, the Japanese soldiers stationed on all those islands. And from my understanding, many of the Japanese on those islands died of malnutrition and thirst because we could sink their supply ships based on because the women broke the codes, we could sink their supply ships before the Japanese soldiers got their supplies.
We have one more question left, unless other people have some other ones lingering. Go ahead, you have time. And this one, it has a bit of a paragraph that goes with it. So, after reading the book about Elizabeth Friedman and her husband, and learning that she basically trained her husband and her supervisors, this person is wondering: did all of these women have male supervisors, and did they know how to do code breaking themselves, or were there specialties in other places?
They all had men supervisors. They all had men supervisors. The women never were elevated to lead a group. They all worked under men, and they trained the men that they worked under. There were a lot of brilliant men code breakers. I don't mean there weren't. But when you think about Agnes Meyer Driscoll starting in 1917, she and Elizabeth Smith Friedman set up the processes. I'm sure William Friedman helped as well, but they set the processes up, how you break codes. There was a process that they used of plugging in numbers and plugging this in and trying this out. And they were the ones that taught the men code breakers that led the departments. And there was a lot of rivalry. The men, according to Liza Mundy, the men did not want the women to rise to the level of leading a group. They wanted to keep the power themselves.
Okay, I believe somewhere back in the questions we had a request to show your resources slide again. So could we pop that slide back up for just a second, so that our at-home audience can see some of the resources that Julia used for her presentation today? I know some of the resources are available in our online museum store, or our in-person museum store. Hopefully the people who are looking for the bibliography can see it now. We had another request come in for it. So, okay, good. Glad we put that up there. So we had another couple of questions come in. So the next one that came in was, can you see your mother's room today? Like, if you went to the school, would you be able to go in and see that room?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, one of my sister's friends worked in that building and she went in that room. It's used as an office now. It's right there in Cordell Hall. Yes, I could go right to that room. And I would like to one day. I'm going to do that one day. I have a car and I can go.
Okay.
And I'm retired.
Okay. So I want to thank everybody for being with us tonight. This has been a really informative presentation, and the Q&A was amazing. Thank you, virtual audience. I appreciate all your questions coming in, and I enjoy that you guys are also talking to each other in the comments section. I'd like to say one last thank you to Julia for your presentation. And then I have a few announcements for our at-home audience for some programs that we have coming up. So thank you again, Julia.
It was my pleasure. It was my pleasure totally to tell her story.
Surprise, we have 2 more webinars this month. I know we usually only have one daytime webinar and occasionally an evening webinar, but we have 2 more lined up for you this month. We have the Battle of Bataan and its significance during World War II and today, which will be on March 19th at 1 p.m. And then we have a special webinar entitled The Kagahashi Project, The Adventures of 4 Hill Country Students in Japan, which will be on March 27th. That will be an evening webinar from 6 to 7, just like this one. And I went on that trip with the students, and I know they are very eager to share their experiences and answer any questions from our lovely at-home audience. So if you'd like to tune in for any of those webinars or look for more information about in-person programs, please click on some of the links that have been provided. Additionally, some of you will notice that I'm wearing a different shirt today. I am highlighting our 80th anniversary hoodie, which is lovely. It is available in our online store and our in-person store, along with some of the books that Julia mentioned tonight. So I want to say one last thank you to everybody for joining us today, and I hope to see you next time.